Hey, what's up? Jeff Ratcliffe here. The Minnesota Vikings are loaded with fantasy firepower, and yet, dare I say, they may be a little bit underrated, especially in one area for 2019. So let's preview for fantasy football in 2019, the Minnesota Vikings. And let's start with the obvious. I don't think the wide receivers are underrated whatsoever. We know this. Last year, Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen both finished as top 12 fantasy options. That is so difficult. That's so rare. It almost doesn't happen in fantasy football to have two guys from the same team finish as wide receiver ones. Okay, I know it happened for the Steelers too last year, but it was a historic year for those purposes. Just so rare. But you know what? With these guys, it's absolutely sustainable going forward that they're going to put up big fantasy numbers. I mean, you look at Adam Thielen and what he was able to do last year at the start of the year. Remember this. 8 straight 100-yard games. He was lights out. Now, he did fade. He got banged up down the stretch and faded a little bit, but still ended up being a very productive wide receiver. Stephon Diggs, maybe not as consistent early in the season, but he has that big-time upside. And like Adam Thielen, put up over 100 catches. He had 102 last year. Now, I will warn you about Diggs. Sometimes people tend to view Stephon Diggs as this big play upside guy. The reality is he wasn't being targeted very heavily downfield. His average depth of target was just 9.8 yards from the line of scrimmage, so relatively close. That short and intermediate areas of the field is where he was being targeted. That being said, Diggs has the big play ability to break some of those short catches for long runs. So the yard after catch ability of Diggs is very appealing. This year, for them to repeat as top 12, it will be hard, but I think they both repeat as top 20, provided they stay healthy. In fact, I have them both as front-end wide receiver twos, just outside the top 12 at 13 and 14 in my wide receiver rankings. So both of them premium options on the same team. And really, because they see so many targets, there's very little meat on the bone for any other receiver. So we're not really worried about that. The other player who might come up is Kyle Rudolph. And yes, I realize he finished 7th among tight ends in fantasy scoring last year. But keep in mind, last year was a little bit of a down year, except for those guys way at the top. The rest of the tight ends for fantasy purposes, it was kind of like week in, week out. You knew you were probably going to get 2 or 3 catches for 20 or 30 yards, and you were just praying for the touchdown, right? Well, Rudolph only scored 4 touchdowns last year, so that shows right now at this point in his career, the ceiling isn't particularly high, and I think the best way to attack tight end this year is to go for those guys with higher ceilings. So despite the fact he finished 7th last year, he's a little bit further down in the ranks. You may want to look elsewhere. But I got to get to the guy who I think is a little bit underrated in this offense, and that, of course, is Kirk Cousins. So before you go shutting the video off, let me explain, all right? Last year was his 4th straight 4,000-yard passing season, and I know in 2019 that isn't as big of a deal as if I said that in like 1989, but still, consistency is there with Cousins. Not to mention the fact that he topped 30 touchdown passes for the first time in his career. So while the widespread fantasy perception is that last year was a down year for Cousins, it actually was a pretty darn good year when you consider his overall numbers. Now, I know the disappointment came because he had an upgrade in surrounding cast, but still the numbers were pretty solid with Cousins. Yet, despite this production, Cousins is generally going at the very end of fantasy drafts. That screams value for fantasy purposes. He is being underrated. You can get Kirk Cousins at the end of your fantasy drafts for a bologna sandwich. I'll take that all day long. It's a free bingo square for Kirk Cousins this year when you consider that he has those 2 receivers. You know, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If a quarterback is throwing to those 2 receivers and we have them ranked that highly, we're likely too low on Kirk Cousins right now. So let's talk about Dalvin Cook as well. He's the other big name in this offense. And you know, the thing about Dalvin Cook is we're widely drafting him as, you know, a top 12 fantasy running back, if not top 10 fantasy running back. And we're pretty much doing this on speculation. I mean, we had that first month of his rookie season before he got injured. And then last year, he was banged up for a good chunk of the year, showed us flashes of fantasy potential, but has yet to put together a full season of fantasy production. But we can read the tea leaves a little bit here, because first and foremost, teams will tell you what they think of their situations in the NFL draft. And while the Vikings did add Alexander Mattison, he's not going to challenge Dalvin Cook for touches like Latavius Murray did last year. So that certainly bodes well. Minimal competition for touches, plus the fact that Gary Kubiak is in the house. He's in the building for the Vikings. That, I think, is going to have an interesting impact on this run game and an interesting effect, a positive one at that, for Dalvin Cook's fantasy football value. If he can stay on the field, Dalvin Cook has some of the biggest breakout potential. He's on the verge of being an elite fantasy back. I'm not going to rank him there, but at this time next year, if we're talking about Dalvin Cook as an elite fantasy option, that would not surprise me in the least. You want to see where Dalvin Cook and the rest of the Minnesota Vikings land in our fantasy football rankings? Go check those out and more at PFF.com.